House Bill 2000, a bill relating to sanctuary policies, reported from the Committee on Local Government with amendment.
The senator from Franklin County, Senator Stanley.
Thank you, Mr. President. I now move that the committee amendment be agreed to.
The question is, shall the committee amendment be agreed to? All in favor of the motion will say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The senator from Franklin County.
Mr. President, I now move that House Bill 2000 pass. And speaking to that bill.
The senator has the floor.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, House Bill 2000, which was the last bill to come out of local governments, is basically a sanctuary city bill. On the amendment, I will walk you through what we struck. But basically, this bill says no locality shall adopt any ordinance, procedure, or policy that restricts the enforcement of federal immigration laws. That's where the bill ends. From there, we put a period in and then struck to less than the full extent permitted by federal law. So basically, Mr. President, what this bill says is that what we already do, which is to enforce the law, that the localities must enforce that law when it comes to immigration law at the federal level. So for those reasons, Mr. President, I move the bill pass.
Thank you, Senator. The question is the senator from Arlington, Senator Favola.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking to the motion.
The senator has the floor.
I urge that the body vote against this bill. It interjects a level of confusion that our local governments are saying they really don't need. As you can see in line 11, it says no locality shall adopt any ordinance, procedure, or policy. That is very unclear. Our local police want to continue to make our communities and our neighborhoods safe. They know the difference between the federal law and local laws. They don't need this confusion, and I ask the body to vote no.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from Western Fairfax County, Senator Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speak to the bill.
The senator has the floor.
I also urge that we reject this bill. The code is a way that we communicate with the citizens of Virginia. And I think what we've done here is create a bill that really doesn't do much. I don't think anybody is contemplating interfering with the federal government. But as it gets interpreted from parents to children and what have you, I think all we've successfully done here is create an instrument that could frighten young children. And I don't think that's a good idea. I think it's a bad message, and I would urge us to reject the bill.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from Eastern Fairfax County, Senator Surville.
Speaking to the bill, Mr. President.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, I represent a district that's a pretty diverse place. I think last time I looked at the U.S. Census, 30% of my constituents were born in another country. And this bill, albeit if you read it legally, I'm not really clear how far it goes, it sends a pretty clear message. And that's a message that we're hearing a lot right now coming from a certain house across the river from my district. And a lot of people are hearing that message, and they're terrified. I just was watching the TV this morning about an executive order that came out this morning, which said that our president is going to hire 10,000 new ICE agents and another 5,000 border guards, and that they intend to deputize local law enforcement to enforce federal immigration law. You couple that with this bill, it could have a lot of unknown consequences, which we don't, I think, even begin to comprehend. About 2 weeks ago, there was a dance in my high school, and my daughter had some of her friends over to have pizza before they went, and one of her friends was from Central America. About 24 hours before that, ICE raided a church in my district. They didn't go in the church. They stood outside of a hypothermia shelter, and then they waited for people to come out of this church hypothermia shelter to ask them if they had seen somebody. And lo and behold, it turns out that some of those people didn't have the right papers. They, by the way, arrested an American, arrested a veteran, and held him for a while until they figured out he was legal. And then they ended up taking a bunch of others, threw them in a van with 10 other guys, and hauled them off to who knows where. I explained this to this girl who was in my kitchen, and she started to cry. I didn't mean to scare her, but she started to cry. This is how children in my district feel today. I had a town hall meeting the next day. I think I mentioned it earlier, about 200 people showed up to my town hall meeting. A second grade teacher stood up in the back and said, we have to deal with this fear these kinds of things generate in school every day. We have to deal with these children coming in crying their parents and their uncles and their aunts are going to be taken away because of these noises that they're hearing. Noises that mainly come out of D.C., but they're starting to come from around here as well. And we don't need to be getting in the middle of this. People at this town hall were in fear of coming out of their house. There were people saying, I had people from their churches worried that ICE was going to stake out a couple of Catholic churches in my district to see who they could talk to walking out the door as soon as church let out because of what's going on. And this bill sends the message that we're going to get right on board with that policy, that we're going to get right on board picking on people who aren't from around here and haul them back to wherever they came from. Mr. President, that's the policy that I don't think, personally, I don't think it's American. I also don't think it's Virginian, and I'll tell you why. You know, last spring, after we got out of session, my wife wanted to go to Bavaria, to Germany. And she wanted to show our kids all these castles and all this medieval stuff they have there. So we went to Germany. While we were driving around through Germany, a couple of the places we went were these old palaces that used to be run by the Catholic bishops that used to govern Germany back in the early 18th century. And I was reading some of the displays, and it talked about how in the early 1700s, the Germans, the governing Catholic Church, decided to purge all the Protestants out of Germany. And I started to think about that because, as you all know, I've mentioned, I have kind of a confused background. I'm half redneck and half Jew. And my Virginia side, the Virginia side of my family, my great-grandmother was named Ayler. And the Ayler family hails from Madison County. They come from a colony originally called the Germanna Colony. You may have heard of Germanna Community College, which is named after it. And those Germans that settled near Culpeper in Madison County, they came over to the United States, guess when? In the early 1700s. Guess why? Because they were the wrong kind of Christians where they came from. And so they came here. And when they came here, you know, Virginia was not a Baptist colony. It was, in fact, run by the Episcopal Church. This General Assembly ran the Episcopal Church, the Church of England. That was the official state church. And then we adopted, when we became independent in 1776, we declared we were going to have a religious test here because we stood for religious diversity, because we stood as a place, as a beacon for people to come over here and live their life and practice their faith however they felt like it. And bills like this, I think, run counter to our values. They run counter to the reasons why this state was founded. They send a horrible message. I think they send an anti-business message, which I think a lot of us care about, that we're not welcoming to people from other countries, that we don't want them here. And, Mr. President, I think it's a bill we ought to vote down.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from Franklin County, Senator Stanley.
Mr. President, if no one else wants to speak, I'll speak to it. If there are others in the queue, you can ask them first, and I'll come back to it.
Thank you for that courtesy, Senator. The senator from Roanoke City, Senator Edwards.
Mr. President, speaking against this bill,
Senator has the floor.
We've dealt with this before. Looking at this very carefully, it says no locality shall basically do anything that restricts enforcement of federal immigration laws. It's limited to immigration laws to less than the extent permitted by federal law. Mr. President, this really turns upside down our federal system of government. Have you thought about that? This is anti-federalism for those of you that have been promoting federalism. When I was United States Attorney for the Western District of Virginia, we had a lot of cooperative joint investigations. Not a lot, but on occasions. Local, state, federal law enforcement officers engaged in pursuit of certain investigations. That was always done cooperatively, voluntarily. The federal government doesn't have any authority to force the state and local authorities to do the federal government's job. And in fact, in the field of immigration, it's exclusively and solely the responsibility and authority of the federal government to enforce the immigration laws. It's not a state issue. It's not a local issue. What this bill does is basically say the state is saying to localities, you have to enforce federal law if it's permitted by federal law. You have to do it. And there are many reasons why the local state authorities would not want to do that. One is economy. Where's the money coming from? Who's paying for this? Out of the state coffers? We're going to have some more budget amendments to make sure our law enforcement authorities have more money to enforce federal law. You know, right now we're having trouble making sure the state police are getting paid properly and so forth. We don't have any extra money to do that. And as you talk to the local state, the state and local authorities, the local police officers, for example, police chiefs, they'll tell you they don't have the resources to do this kind of job. So that's one issue, economy. The second issue is there are compelling reasons why this local police chiefs do not want to enforce federal immigration laws. They have a duty to maintain the protection of the citizens in their communities. They have the duty to maintain law and order, to maintain cooperation on the part of the people in the community to enforce law and order. They need people to help them. The police cannot enforce the law unless the citizens cooperate. And you go into some of the immigrant communities in particular where there are a large number of immigrants, and if they think the local authorities are there as, in effect, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials, to find out who's illegal and deport them, they're not going to cooperate. That's a fact. Talk to any chief of police or any police officer in the Commonwealth of Virginia, they'll tell you the same thing. We don't have the resources to do it, and furthermore, it's counterproductive. It keeps us from enforcing the law in the communities, especially immigrant communities where a lot of New Virginians come from other parts of the world. If they think we're there to find out who's not undocumented and have them deported, they'll clam up. They won't cooperate. We know that as a fact. This bill is counterproductive, Mr. President. I know it sends a message in some quarters, which I think is unfortunate in Virginia. But, Mr. President, this bill is a bad bill. We should defeat it, and we should send the message that Virginia is welcoming. But not only that, we should send a message that we want to make sure our job at the state and local level in terms of enforcing the laws is protected. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from Grayson County, Senator Carrico.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, not being a lawyer, and I know that many of us in here are non-lawyers, don't get into that little gray area of the law, and this is one of those simple bills, the one-sentence bill, that basically prohibits localities from setting up a sanctuary location within that city for anyone who's violating immigration laws. You know, we're a nation of laws. I said this in committee, and we abide within those laws. And basically what this bill is doing is saying to the localities, you're not going to set up a sanctuary to prohibit the federal government from coming in and enforcing the federal immigration laws. And it would be no different than the fact that we have laws against stealing and shoplifting, but people do it because they're hungry sometimes. They do it because they're cold and need clothing to clothe themselves or their children. Are we going to allow sanctuaries to be set up to protect people from doing those things? What we're trying to do, what this bill is trying to do, is say to those localities that you're not going to set a sanctuary up to prohibit the enforcement of those federal laws that prohibit the illegal act of coming here. If they're coming here legally, I hear the thing that if we pass this, we're going to scare the young people to death and all this. Well, if it is a legal act, there's nothing to fear. One of the things that I taught my kids over and over is the best way to stay out of trouble is don't get into trouble. And, you know, it's just beyond me to hear the arguments that this bill is going to bestow fear on everyone. These are not intended for people who are going through the legal process. And I would hope that we would just see the simplicity of what this bill does, and that we would actually vote to pass the bill, that we don't set up sanctuaries that are going to protect people who are committing illegal acts. And that is basically what this bill does, and I hope that we pass the bill.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from Lynchburg, Senator Peake.
Mr. President, speaking to the bill.
The senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I had not initially planned to speak on this bill, but after hearing fellow senators on the other side of the aisle, I think this bill has been mischaracterized. This bill is about the rule of law. If there are laws, they have to be enforced. If there are federal laws, the localities do not get to choose which federal laws they will enforce. If there are state laws, the localities do not get to choose which state laws they will enforce. This bill addresses some false perceptions that are being created not just across the Commonwealth, but across the country. Some cities are saying to illegal immigrants, people who are here illegally, people who are subject to being deported, come to our city and you will be protected. We will not enforce these laws. They are not being protected because the federal government still has the right to enforce immigration laws. They have the duty to enforce immigration laws. It is their responsibility to enforce our borders. And if the current administration is going to enforce our laws and enforce our borders, it doesn't matter which city the people who are here illegally go to, they are subject to those laws. This law, this bill, this one sentence bill simply states localities do not override the federal government, and I support this bill.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from Russell County, Senator Chafin.
Thank you, Mr. President. Throughout the history of our country, we've seen laws come and go. We've seen them change. We've seen as the needs of society, as the requirements of society changed, we've seen laws change. We've seen them come on and off the books. But until the last number of recent years, one thing we haven't seen that we're seeing today in society is a group of people who don't want to follow the laws. A significant group of people, Mr. President. And we don't get to pick and choose what laws that we want to follow in this country. This is a nation of law, of rule, and of order. We've had our law enforcement officers lay down their blood and lay down their lives for our laws in this country. We dishonor them when we talk about not following the laws of this country. And when we do get to the point where significant numbers of people are picking and choosing whether or not they want to follow the laws of this country, then the very civilization of this country is weakened and begins to crumble. And we've seen, again, throughout the history of the world, civilizations crumble and topple as a result of a lack of respect for the laws of those countries. So until somebody changes the laws of this country, I'm going to very strongly speak to people every chance I get about following those laws, because I believe in the rule of law. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. The junior senator from Richmond City, Senator McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I understand that immigration law is something that this Commonwealth and this country has been struggling with for over 400 years, when the first settlers here came illegally to settle at Jamestown. We don't need a state law telling our localities that they can't impede federal law. We already have one. It's called the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution of the United States. In our federal system of government, the federal government has preempted immigration because it is part of the federal power of diplomacy in dealing with foreign governments. This is not just about the rule of law. This is a message bill. Whether it is intended to send a message or not, it sends a message and has to be viewed in a larger context of what is happening in this country today. And you've heard part of it. There are people here in this country legally who came legally, but their visa might have expired. They've applied for a new one, but it hasn't come through yet. There are also people who were born here legally, but their ancestors might have come from another country legally. And what is happening today is both American citizens and people who might be here undocumented are all being caught up in ICE raids to the point, this bill was brought as a public safety measure. It is having the opposite effect. When an ICE agent walks into a courthouse to detain a woman who is there trying to escape her abuser to get a protective order, and her abuser calls ICE agents to go pick her up, this sends a message to everyone who looks like they might not be of an Anglo-Saxon background, whether they were born here or not. It sends a message, you might be rounded up. And that's okay. That's what this bill says, whether we intend it or not, because it's not necessary. We heard in committee, there are no sanctuary cities in Virginia. There are no cities trying to be sanctuary cities. There are cities, and the city of Richmond is one of them, that has said it is more important to us to have community policing where the police will go out and talk to victims and witnesses of crimes and not ask about their immigration status, and will choose not to voluntarily enter into an ICE 287G agreement, which they're not required under federal law to do. Now, that is something that some of our localities are doing because they have found it is more productive for them to fight crime if people are willing to talk to them. And there are a lot of people, yes, children and adults, who are terrified. Again, some of them born here, some of them American citizens, who are terrified to talk to anybody in government, in the police department, because they don't know what the consequences of that will be. And that is why we should not pass this bill.
Thank you, Senator. The senior senator from Virginia Beach, Senator Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you. I'm looking at this, and I'm kind of reflecting back at the last 8 years up in Washington, D.C. And I've seen all kinds of combinations. I've seen Republican House, Democrat President, Democrat Senate. I've seen Democrat Senate, Democrat House, Democrat President. I've seen both houses, Republican and a Democrat President. I've seen it all. Never once did I ever see a law passed that changed the immigration laws of this country. Never once. And I don't think anyone in Washington felt like our borders ought to be wide open to anybody who wants to come in without any control. I think everybody in Washington obviously must have supported the idea that you come into this country legally or you shouldn't come into this country at all. Otherwise, I think the law would have changed, but it never did change. So when I hear these arguments like somehow we're not going to enforce the law, somehow a law that neither political party seem ready to change, to keep into process, that we're not going to change the law, then clearly the law is enforced. If the law is not enforced, then why have the law to begin with? And so I'm struck a little bit by the fact that we're actually going to enforce the laws that are passed in Congress, that are legal that all of a sudden have created this outrage that we're not going to enforce the law. And all this bill does, as I understand this bill, is just say you can't set up a city that says we're going to set up a city specifically to go up against the federal law, which seems pretty obvious to me that we shouldn't have to have a bill like this, but obviously we need a bill like this just to make it clear to some localities that we're not going to do this. And I'm also struck by the fact that if you look, and I'm not trying to pick on one country or another, but I just had a process, just kind of Googled, what if I'm in Mexico illegally? If I'm an illegal immigrant in Mexico? It's a felony and it's a 2-year punishable in prison. After you serve your sentence and you come back in and you try to come back into the country and get caught, it's a 10-year sentence. If you extend your visa in Mexico beyond your visa date, it's a felony. If you aid and abet an illegal immigrant in Mexico, it's also a crime. So I would submit to you that while some may portray what we do in this country as harsh, or someone may portray that actually trying to enforce the law is somehow harsh, that in fact, I suspect Mexico is not separate in the way that it treats. I suspect if I started Googling other countries, I'd find some similar type measure there. So all we're asking here, I think, is come into this country legally, or please don't come in at all. Now, should laws be changed? Should we open up guest worker programs? Should we do those things in Washington? Personally, I feel we do. As long as we know who's coming in and who's a guest worker and when they go home, I think that's altogether appropriate. I think there's a number of measures Washington can take but have failed to take to this date to move it forward. And so I think there's a process that needs to be done in Washington. We can't do a thing about it here in Richmond, but I would hope we'd support this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. The senior senator from Fairfax County, Senator Saslaw.
Brought to you by Wagner for governor. I don't know if that's her title, the junior senator from Richmond. She was exactly right in every single thing that she said. It's interesting that all the people who've spoken in favor of this bill, none of them come from a municipality that's agreed to enter into an agreement with ICE on 287G. That's the enforcement. So in theory, with the exception of anybody here from Prince William County, Senator McPike, with the exception of Senator McPike, everybody else lives in a sanctuary county and a sanctuary city and a sanctuary town. And I don't see, not a single one of you all who've spoken in support of this bill, why don't you, if it's such a good idea, what you need to do is to get your local government to contact the Immigration and Customs and Enforcement and tell them that you want to be part of the 287G program. It's called putting your money where your mouth is, okay? Senator McClellan was exactly right. This is a message bill. Sends a terrible message, but let me essentially tell you how effective messages are. Used to be a Hollywood producer. His name was Samuel Goldwyn. He was one of the founders of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer for you younger people in here. And Sam Goldwyn made a lot of very fabulous, he did make a lot of money. He produced a tremendous amount of those MGM musicals that you saw, or that some of you have seen, in the 40s and 50s. And people would say to him, Sam, your movies are great, but they don't have a message. You know what Goldwyn used to tell him? You want to send a message? Go see Western Union. That's about how effective this bill would be. I doubt if there's a single municipality in this state that, as a result of this bill, is going to call the Immigration and Customs and Enforcement and say, how do we join your program? And by the way, Prince William had some problems with that. Guess what? ICE wasn't coming to pick these people up. And they told them, we're not interested in picking up people, who ran a red light. That's not what we're about. So we're sending a message. It's a pretty lousy one. But as effectiveness, big goose egg. Big goose egg. By the way, we had a problem similar to this back around from around 37 through 40. Some people from Europe, quite a few of them, tried to get into this country. FDR blocked it. Okay? He blocked it. Told them, go back where you came from. They did. I saw what happened to them when I visited Auschwitz last summer. Okay? That's why a lot of these people leave these places and they come here. And they come here looking for a break. And you might take a look at where a lot of the Nobel Prize winners of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s came from. They were immigrants. And some of them didn't quite, some of them had a lot of trouble getting here. And by the way, we didn't have any immigration laws in this country until 1922, other than, I think, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1980, because we were using them as slaves to build the coast-to-coast railroads. So we've not benefited one bit by turning people away from these other countries who are coming here to get away from potential death as a result of who's running those countries. You notice they're not coming here from Canada. They're coming here from basically these countries that are totally undemocratic and lawless. So, when you do these kinds of things, you don't send a very good message. Also, from a political standpoint, you're making a future demographic group of this country awful upset. And just from a political standpoint, I'll tell you, it's not a wise thing to do. So you can vote for this bill, and you can go back and tell people I'm tough on illegal immigration, okay? But I don't think a single one of you in here is, unless you can convince your local governments to enter into that 287G with Immigration Customs Enforcement. And by the way, the only one so far in this state is Prince William County. Not Henrico, not Lynchburg, not any of these other places. No, not yet. Only 38 other municipalities, if that article in the Richmond Times-Dispatch was accurate the other day, only 38 other municipalities in America belong to that, are part of the 287G program. So don't give me this how we're going to get tough on immigration. We're not going to do anything by this bill other than send a bad message, a weak one but a bad one. I'll answer your question now.
Mr. Senator from Rockingham.
All I wanted to ask was whether the senior senator from Fairfax overlooked perhaps the fact that Rockingham and Shenandoah counties are members of 287G.
Though that must be new because they weren't as of last year.
As of 2007, they have been.
I stand corrected.
Thank you,
I stand corrected. And if anybody else's county's in it, I'd like to know it. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, members of the Senate.
Thank you, Senator. The junior senator from Virginia Beach, Senator DiStep.
Mr. President, speaking in support of the bill, and I just want to clarify for the senior senator from Fairfax that Rockingham, Shenandoah, and 6 other departments in the state of Virginia are involved with the program and have been since 2007.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from Franklin County, Senator Stanley.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's good news. That means I'm the last one to speak on this bill. Hopefully, unless I create some questions. Mr. President, this bill is a simple statement of what we should be doing in terms of the Supremacy Clause. The junior senator from Richmond is exactly right. Imagine for yourself if cities throughout the United States or any city in Virginia would have said, we're going to become a sanctuary for anyone that wants to discriminate in violation of federal law. We're going to protect you from that federal law against anti-discrimination. What would we do? What would we all do? Because it's the law, an important law. And there's a reason for that law. The immigration laws are laws that have been on our books for quite some time. Perhaps in the last 8 years they have been selectively enforced, perhaps for humanitarian reasons, perhaps for political reasons. But all laws must be applied equally. In all areas and regions of the Commonwealth of Virginia must treat all people, citizens, non-citizens alike, in the same manner in respect of the law. I'm reminded of, and not to throw back into history like the senior senator from Fairfax likes to do on occasion, but if you remember in the 60s, there was the TV show that I grew up on, Sonny and Cher. You remember that? Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. President, Sonny Bono, after his career on TV and as the group Sonny and Cher broke up and his marriage broke up, he later ran for Congress in California, surprisingly as a Republican. And he was in a debate, and the moderator asked him, Mr. Bono, what are your views regarding illegal immigration? And in classic Sonny Bono fashion, he said, well, it's illegal. And that's exactly right. It's against the law. And I think when you create these sanctuary cities, it's really not the people that are there that are trying to make something of themselves. A lot of times, it's those that seek to do others harm, that have come across our borders not legally, and harm not only those citizens of the United States, but even those who are not citizens of the United States. My fellow members of the local government committee remember a story I told about one of my own clients who was an illegal immigrant. Hard worker, great guy, great family, children born in the United States. The drug cartels came over, killed one of his family members, threatened his other family members, and said, you must do what we say or we will kill your family. And so he did. And he is now in federal prison awaiting deportation. It is not so much him that I do not want in this country. It is the person that kills others, threatens others, and makes good people do bad things, or does bad things to good people. I'm reminded, Mr. President, of just even an article that came out on February 22nd. I think we all watch the news enough, but I will remind you once again. An illegal alien who was set free by a sanctuary city and never deported is now charged with killing a man just weeks after his release. Ever Valles, 19, murdered Timothy Cruz, age 32, on February 7th after robbing him at a train station. He had been released by the Denver Sheriff Department just 6 weeks before that, after posting a $5,000 bond on the charges of grand theft. Denver, a sanctuary city, had released Valles, even though U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents had asked repeatedly the city to hold him. In fact, ICE had flagged Valles as an immigration priority given his ties to gang activity in the city, and asked to be told before any attempt to release him so that they could arrest them themselves. The ICE officials say the city failed to keep its deal. The detainer we had placed on this gentleman was not honored, and he was released by the jail without any prior notification. Valles was a known gang member whose gang history was documented even in the local state of Colorado database, the agency said. So, today, the family of Timothy Cruz mourns the loss of their son. One person, you may say. But Mr. President, the death of one person at the hand of someone who should not be here and who would do others harm is one death too many. That's why this bill makes sense. Let us not become Denver. Let us not have a Denver. And for the love of all things good, let us not have a family of a Timothy Cruz who is no longer on this planet for no other reason than he was at a train station waiting to get a train when his life was taken by someone who should have been detained and should have not been in this country. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. The question is, shall House Bill 2000 pass? All in favor of the motion will record their votes aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their votes? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 20, noes 20.
Ayes 20, noes 20. The chair votes no. The bill does not pass.
House Bill 2245.
The senator from James City County.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Having voted on the prevailing side by which the bill did not pass, I'd ask we reconsider that vote.
Thank you, Senator. The question is, shall the vote by which House Bill 2000 did not pass be reconsidered? All in favor of the motion will record their votes aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their votes? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 40, no 0.
Ayes 40, no 0. The motion is agreed to. The senator from Franklin County.
Thank you, Mr. President. For the reasons previously expressed by myself and almost everybody else in this room, I now move for the passage of HB 2000.
Thank you, Senator. The question is, shall House Bill 2000 pass? All in favor of the motion will record their votes aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their votes? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 21, noes 19.
Ayes 21, noes 19. The bill passes.
House Bill